let's start with Putin's preconditions before the summit in Switzerland. And when it comes to these conditions on the part of Putin, how the Russian public opinion has perceived these preconditions? Are they satisfied with these preconditions?
I think that these conditions are non-negotiable. I think that the Russians, as a whole, trust Putin to do his job. I don't think that there's any heckling going on and no second guessing, as far as I can tell. Most people are basically trying to interpret what he said, and the big question is what he spelled out is unavoidable from the Russian side, and I can get into detail on that, and completely unacceptable from the American side. So he said that Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, and of course Crimea, are Russian Federation territory by constitution. So there can be no negotiation as to their status. And any permanent resolution to the crisis has to do with international treaty-based recognition of their legitimate membership in the Russian Federation based on public referenda in accordance with the populations of these regions' right to self-determination as enshrined in the UN Charter. So that is basically the starting point, and from that it follows that the Ukrainians should get the hell out of Russia, which is where they are now. The Ukrainian troops are on Russian territory, not on Ukrainian territory. It was once Ukrainian, but it isn't anymore. So that's number one. Number two is denazification and demilitarization, which are the aims of the special military operation and not subject to change. What Russia wants is victory. The victory could come on the battlefield, or it can come as a result of accepting Russia's terms. The fact that Russia's terms aren't being accepted means that these objectives will be achieved on the battlefield. That's really all it means. And lastly, the West and all the other countries that jumped on the bandwagon and joined Washington's sanctions against Russia have to lift all of these sanctions because they're illegal. The only party that can legally impose international sanctions is the United States Security Council. Nobody else has the right to do it. So by imposing sanctions on Russia, the United States and all the other countries that the United States has forced to impose sanctions on Russia, the European Union, most of the individual countries that are in the wake of the United States, such as Japan, South Korea, etc. They broke international law, so they have to make things right. They have to remove these sanctions. They have to pay reparations for the damage that they caused to the Russian economy for these sanctions, and then we can proceed on that basis. And if not, we can just continue with the war. So that is basically what Putin said. Now, the reason he said it is because he's a Christian, and Christians allow people to repent before they go to hell or heaven. You know, they get a chance to save their souls. So if Washington doesn't want to repent, they can go to hell. That's basically Russia's stance.
Why he decided to put these preconditions out before the summit in Switzerland?
He put out these preconditions, first of all, because he wanted to give specific instructions to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, because they're there are different interests, different approaches within the ministry. And he wanted the ministerial representatives to speak with a single voice and refuse to abide by the lies being spread about Russia and not accept anything except what Russia would accept as a whole. He gave them very good indications of what their role is and what they have to do. In a lot of cases, it means that they have nothing more to do in Western capitals, including Washington. That's a little sad, but they had nothing to do there before, in any case, except for some trivial meetings here and there. And this has clarified their position. As far as the meeting that, or the non-meeting that took place in Switzerland, there's a bit of history to that. First of all, that meeting was scheduled a long time ago, and pretty early on, Sergei Lavrov met with the Swiss and explained to them that such a meeting would be unacceptable because Switzerland has lost its neutrality by joining anti-Russian sanctions. So Switzerland can no longer act as an intermediary in good faith. And the Swiss got pretty ruffled about that. That ruffled their feathers. They marched out of the meeting rather red-faced, I recall. But they didn't really understand what that meant. And what that meant is that any meeting that the Swiss decide to organize is basically null and void. The other thing is that why this meeting was organized. The idea was that last summer, and it was being organized way back then, last summer, the Ukrainian military, rearmed by NATO, was ready to attack the Russian defensive lines. And the idea was that it would defeat Russia, humiliate Russia. It would break those lines. It would separate Crimea from the Russian mainland, maybe destroy the Crimea Bridge and completely separate Crimea, sever the link, and put Russia in a situation where it would have to agree to just about anything. Basically, they wanted Russia to capitulate. That was the expectation. Now, the reality was that the Ukrainians never made it even up to Russia's first defensive line, one of three defensive lines, the so-called Surovikin line of defense, built to very exacting Russian standards. And the Ukrainians pretty much spent the entire summer suffering huge losses of men and equipment, completely unable to change the situation at the front, and eventually had to concede that their counteroffensive was a complete and total failure. But the inertia behind this meeting in Switzerland and all of the words that were said and Zelensky's list of conditions, such as Russia retreating to the borders defined in 1991, paying reparations, lots of other pipe dreams, I would say. That has gained quite a lot of momentum as well, because everybody talked about it. Everybody said, yes, we'll get together in Switzerland and we'll vote on this and we'll ratify this list and we'll force Russia to do all of this stuff, and Russia will be defeated and we'll win, and everything will be just peaches and cream from that point on for us. But given as the Ukraine was defeated at the front, this meeting in Switzerland took on a sort of zombie existence. The demands that Zelensky had voiced and put on his wish list looked just completely ridiculous. So all of them except three had to be knocked off the list. And the three were food security, nuclear non-proliferation, and exchange of prisoners. And somehow somebody, I don't remember who, penciled in that the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which is the largest in Europe, which now stands on Russian territory in the Zaporozhye region, had to be given back to the Ukraine. So I'm not sure what that would entail. Were the Ukrainians going to lease it from Russia, seeing as it stands on Russian territory? In any case, I haven't heard anything of that demand either. So these three toothless demands pretty much meant nothing. The meeting took place, but most people who were invited did not attend. The majority of the population of the planet ignored it completely. It was pretty much just the West plus some really gigantic countries like the island of Vanuatu. I don't remember if the Solomon Islands were present or not, but basically these micro countries were invited and maybe paid a little money. But all the big countries, including huge ones like China, just did not show up. And so the meeting is completely irrelevant. It is as if it didn't happen and everybody should stop talking about it.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that none of the BRICS countries has signed or has supported the final declaration in this summit in Switzerland. And the other thing that is important about these preconditions on Putin's part was he's willing to build on those negotiations in Istanbul. He's talking about that would be the basis, that would be the foundation of this type of negotiation, and considering the current conditions on the battlefield in Ukraine.
I think Putin basically gave two options. One is he's going to get everything he wants without war, and the other one is he's going to get everything he wants with war. Take it or leave it. It's not like he's going to negotiate. He spelled out what has to be done, including the lifting of sanctions, including the Ukrainian troops clearing out of Russian lands as they stand now, which includes former Ukrainian lands, including international recognition of Russia's new borders, including denazification and demilitarization of the Ukraine as a whole, which probably includes trials for all of the war criminals on the Ukrainian side. All of that has to happen. If it doesn't happen, then the war continues. That's all it means. And you have to keep in mind that this was a speech before it wasn't a speech before the military men, before the Ministry of Defense of Russia. It was a speech before the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. It was instructions for the people, the diplomats on the Russian side, as to what they should be saying when they meet with their foreign counterparts to make sure that Russia's position is crystal clear for everyone, and so that everyone understands what is non-negotiable. It is not as if Putin is being cautious. It is Putin basically saying that we can achieve various things without war if the other side sees the light. And if they don't see the light, then we'll achieve everything we want with war.
Yeah. How about the reaction coming out of the West, the United States, right after these conditions coming out? We've learned that Lloyd Austin said that Putin has no right to do that, to put out these preconditions. If Ukrainians are not agreeing with these conditions, if the United States is against putting out any sort of conditions, what would be the outcome in your opinion?
War. The outcome will be more war. Now, every time Putin makes an offer, it is worse than the previous offer for the quote-unquote Ukrainian side. So the previous offer that was made in Istanbul basically made Donetsk and Lugansk and Crimea Russian territory, but Zaporozhye and Kherson could remain within the Ukraine, provided the Ukraine provided servitude in the form of providing a land route from the Russian mainland to Crimea. So now that is off the table because Zaporozhye and Kherson are Russian sovereign territory, and that is no longer a question. So by waiting a little while, the Ukraine lost 2 more regions. So now it's down 5 regions. Now I made a little chart that will maybe be helpful in looking forward to what Putin's next offers are likely to be. I don't know how frequently he will make these offers. Maybe once a year, maybe once every couple of years. This is a slow process. You know, you have to understand that okay, Russia is huge, but the Ukraine is the largest country in Europe by far, and so it takes a long time for Russia to process it. So far, it has processed 5 regions: Crimea, Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson. That's let's call that phase 2. Phase 1 was Crimea. Phase 2 was the 4 that I just listed. Phase 3 will be Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, and Odessa. And that might be this time next year that those will become Russian sovereign territory. And if the Americans still aren't agreeable to that, then the next phase will be phase 4, which will include Chernigov, Sumy, Poltava, and Kirovograd regions. And that takes us, I guess, halfway through the putative Trump administration. But if the United States is still not agreeable, then there's phase 5, which is Cherkasy, Zhytomyr, Vinnytsia, and Kiev regions. And at that point, Russia is done. It doesn't really have to continue military operations because at that point, the Ukraine no longer exists. The remaining regions will go to Poland or Hungary or Romania and will be their concern, not Russia's concern. And if they continue to attack Russia, well, they won't, because then at that point, that would be an attack from NATO, which is unspeakable, and nobody even talks about it, and that's unspeakable and unthinkable and all of that. So they basically get rid of the remnants of the Ukrainian military at that point, and it will be that the remaining regions will become a sort of, if you will, Gremlin preserve for Ukrainian Nazis. Their little homeland, sort of like the Idlib province in northern Syria, where they're allowed to romp free, but not cause any problems for Russia. So that lays out an ambitious long-range plan for absorbing the rest of the Ukraine into Russia. And it can proceed strictly along diplomatic lines, where each region votes in a public referendum to join Russia and does so. Now, you have to understand that, let's see, I even wrote down this date. Mark this date on your calendar, August 11th. The federal government of the Ukraine ceases to exist. Right now, the Ukraine is a country without a president because the presidency of Vladimir Zelensky ended in May. The term, according to the Ukrainian constitution, the term of a Ukrainian president is strictly 5 years. After that, he has to, well, before that, he has to be reelected or somebody else has to be elected. And then there's another 5-year term that starts. But Zelensky is now a nobody. He's not a president of a country. He's just an interloper, a squatter, if you will. There will be no negotiations with him. He doesn't represent anything or anyone. Now, the other thing is that according to the Ukrainian constitution, it is the Ukrainian parliament, Verkhovna Rada, which inherits the power from the president once his term lapses. And it is the speaker of the Ukrainian parliament that becomes the commander-in-chief and the chief executive, except that he said that he doesn't want to. And so there is nobody in charge. And there's nobody, because there's nobody in charge, there's nobody to negotiate with. The entire apparatus that Zelensky has put together is out to pasture. They're nobodies, and they represent nothing, and they have no ability to sign any documents, any official documents, or to spend any money or do anything. So they're gone, they're done. But the funny thing is that on August 11th, the Ukrainian parliament turns into a pumpkin because elections have been canceled, and according to the Ukrainian constitution, those are the terms. On August 11th, the Ukrainian parliament ceases to exist. So without an executive and without a legislature, Ukraine no longer has a federal government, and power devolves to the regions. At that point, all the individual regions can hold public referenda and decide to join Russia if they so wish. So that might not happen all at once. It might happen one region at a time. For instance, Mykolaiv and Odessa are pretty high on the list. But eventually it might happen to just about all of them. Perfectly legal according to the UN Charter, according to international law. Everybody would have to recognize this eventually, whether they like it or not. And the United States would then be pretty well out of the picture.
In the stage 3, that would be the next stage of the conflict in Ukraine, you said the cities would be Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Odessa, if I'm not mistaken.
And Kharkiv.
Yeah. And if
it's a Russian, you know.
Yeah, if the conflict goes in that direction, do you think that, let's assume that Russia, this conflict continues and Russia takes these cities, and we have a political change in the United States that is willing to negotiate with Russia, do you think after taking these regions, Russia would negotiate on Odessa, Nikolaev, these cities that are so important that that would be an access to the Black Sea for Ukrainians? In this summit in Switzerland, they were talking about the ports and trades that they need the access to the Black Sea. Do you think at the end of the day, if something happens in the West, that they would be interested in some sort of negotiations and political settlement, Russia would negotiate Odessa and Nikolaev or not?
Well, I think Putin has spelled out his terms. It's either war or what he said needs to happen. And if what he said doesn't happen, then it's going to be more war. Now, how does negotiation enter into it, and who would he negotiate with? Anybody who's read his speech might have noticed that a large chunk of that speech was devoted to various types of negotiations that went on prior to the putsch in 2014, after it, the Minsk agreements. If you recall, there was endless chatter in the West of Russia not fulfilling its obligations under the Minsk agreements, neglecting the fact that Russia has zero obligations under Minsk agreements. Those agreements were between Donetsk, Lugansk, and Kiev. They did not involve Russia in any way. So, and then after a while, it became known that from Western leaders, from Merkel and Land, that the Minsk agreements were a ruse to buy time to train and equip the Ukrainians for further military action. So they were fooled. And then after the start of the special military operation, there were meetings culminating with the documents tentatively agreed to in Istanbul, which were then thrown out. And so where does that leave Russia? Are Russians supposed to be foolish enough to continue negotiating with these liars and thieves? Wouldn't that make Russians very stupid in their own eyes if they then continued to try to negotiate with not the Ukrainians, never mind them, but with the Americans who control the Ukrainians? That seems like a very silly thing for Russia to try to do. But people keep talking about negotiations. Yesterday I watched a video with Jeffrey Sachs, and poor Jeffrey, he used the word negotiations about 300 times in a short video. He's really sold on the idea of, negotiating with Russia. Russia is not sold on the idea of negotiating with the United States. There's nobody in the United States for Russia to negotiate with. Who? Biden? Blinken? Who? There's nobody, and there's a vacuum. Plus, by the time they schedule some negotiations, it'll be February of 2025, and who knows who's going to be in charge then, if anyone, or maybe the United States will be in the midst of a civil war, and all of this will be moot anyway. So why would Russia want to negotiate with a country that's in such sad shape and not trustworthy at all? Why would it pretend to negotiate with the Ukrainians if it knows that they're all puppets controlled from Washington? Why would it negotiate with the Europeans knowing that all of the European leaders have just been thrown out? They just haven't realized it yet, but their voters have thrown them out of office, pretty much, a lot of them. So the whole thing, the whole negotiation thing is pointless. Putin has made his gesture as a man of peace and a Christian, offering this, if you will, this way of redemption, atoning for the West's sins so that they do not go to hell. But if they don't take that offer, then they should feel absolutely free to go to hell. Absolutely free.
If something happens in Ukraine, if they decide to change the political parties, these people who are in power, if they say that Zelensky is not anymore the president of Ukraine, and let's have some sort of elections in Ukraine and decide who's going to be the next president of Ukraine, would that change the mindset of Russians?
Why should it? The objectives are exactly the same. The question is who controls the Ukraine. If the Americans control the Ukraine, there's no point to talking about the Ukraine or the Ukrainians.
No, my point is this: a political change in the United States, and at the same time having a political change, having some political changes in Ukraine, and Zelensky administration being replaced by another administration. How would that work out for any sort of political settlement?
It wouldn't. You have to understand that the Ukraine is no longer any sort of a democracy. It was rather tentative as a democracy to start with. For instance, if the Americans didn't like the outcome of an election, they could just call another round of elections until their candidate got in. That happened once. The current government is in power as a result of a violent, unconstitutional overthrow of the previous constitutional government. So it is illegitimate to start with. The elections have been canceled and canceled long enough for the entire government to become illegitimate according to the Constitution. So there's no legal basis on which a new constitution could be passed, or basically the entire thing is in a cul-de-sac. It is done. On the other hand, in terms of the actual governance of the Ukraine, it is a totalitarian state. It is a fascist totalitarian state that kills people who don't agree with it, that tortures people. There are lots of people, political prisoners, rotting in jail in the Ukraine. Lots of people have been outright killed. It is a country that is destroying its population, and it is blowing up from within. For instance, all of the people who are in charge in getting the cannon fodder together to send to the front are having their cars set on fire all over the place. They're being attacked on the street by people. There's no shortage of people who are what is called the underground in the Ukraine, who are actively working to help the Russian side. The communications are very active, and the intelligence coming out of the Ukraine is very good. So this totalitarian state is falling apart. It is degenerating. And as I said, August 11th, the Ukraine no longer has a federal government. It no longer has a legislature, and it no longer has an executive. And its legal system has been sidelined for a long time because it's a shambles of a legal system where you basically bribe judges to get the outcome you want. And it's been that way for a long time. So the Kiev regime is nearing its end. After that, political power devolves to the regions, and it's the regions that decide what they want to do next. And you can pretty well bet that the regions, pretty much none of them, want to go to war against Russia, no matter what the Americans want them to do. Now, the only question is, how long can this totalitarian regime hold together, hold on to power, even though it doesn't have any legitimacy? And that is a very good question, given that most of the electric grid has been destroyed, and next winter is going to be absolutely brutal. I don't think that there's going to be too many levers left that the federal government can control. Things are going to get out of control. And so we shouldn't really see the future of the Ukraine as some sort of happy democratic experiment where they decide that Zelensky is bad and find somebody who's good and elect that good person, and inaugurate that person as president and live happily ever after. There's no live happily ever after for the Ukraine. In fact, there's no future for the country. That really has to be realized at this point.
Yeah. How about, Dmitry, what has happened in the European Union considering these new elections? You're trying to picture what has happened in Europe as a movement toward the right-wing parties. But do you see it as a movement toward these parties, or they're trying to find an alternative in Europe, and they're trying to change the policy of the official policy of the European Union or European countries?
Well, there's the European Parliament, which doesn't matter at all. The fact that the right-wing parties got a few more seats makes no difference at all. Their votes are going to be so diluted in this complex process of forming coalitions that it won't make any difference at all. It looks like Ursula von der Leyen will stick around. It looks like there's going to be the same sort of structure in charge of the whole system, the European Commission, and etc. Nothing there will change. And you have to understand that the structure of the European Union is not really internally controlled. It is externally controlled. The whole European Union structure, together with NATO, was conceived to make it easier for the Americans to control Europe. So basically, within the United States, there's the Pentagon. Within the Pentagon, there's NATO. And within NATO, there's the European Union. It's sort of a matryoshka doll sort of structure. And so elections don't really matter. Elections are just for show. Now, the the other question is whether these major European countries, specifically France and Germany, whose economies are doing worse and worse, will remain governable internally. And with France, for instance, it's a very interesting picture because when the conservatives gain power in France, the liberals, the left wingers, start street battles and start ransacking the place. And so the Ukraine could, the France could very easily become rather ungovernable. And in Germany, the situation is rather different, which is you have Alice Weidel with the AfD, and then you have the Wagenknecht party. They're on the opposite sides of the spectrum, but they're gaining. And what a weird coalition that would be. That would be almost a red-brown coalition. But that has happened before in the history of Germany, funny thing is. And the person who popped out like Jack out of a box from that process of coalition building and inclusiveness was Adolf Hitler. So maybe the demons of Germany will reappear again in the form of a national coalition government that includes AfD, includes Wagenknecht. And the other thing that is very noticeable about Germany is that East Germany seems to be ready to go its own way because they voted for AfD. So we have to wait. There's some elections coming up, both in France and in Germany. We'll have to see what happens. But my feeling is that the economic degradation that is happening all over Europe has to affect how possible it will be to continue governing these two major European countries. And my feeling is not very well at all.
How much the conflict in Ukraine has influenced the European Union, especially European countries? We're talking about Germany that was so dependent on Russia. And we know that we've learned that Spain, just after 3 months, they started importing Russian steel and iron. And Financial Times wrote an article that the Russian gas just overtook the United States gas going to Europe in May. This shows how how important Russia is for Europe. And how do you see the outcome of all of these pictures together?
Well, let's take a very short trip down memory lane. The plan was to force Russia to counterattack the Ukraine to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in the Donbas. And as soon as Russia attacked, Russia would be saddled with sanctions, which would destroy Russia economically. It would make the Russians extremely upset to the point of ousting Putin. That would give the Americans an opening to foment a color revolution in Russia and insert somebody Yeltsin-like into the Kremlin, and then break Russia into lots of small countries, each of which easy to disarm and rob, giving the West another 30 years of prosperity at Russia's expense. That was a brilliant plan. It misfired almost immediately because instead of engaging the Ukrainians in the Donbas, the Russians pretty much occupied all of eastern Ukraine. And then seeing as that was a a little much, they withdrew to defensible lines and waited for the Ukrainians to attack by constructing defensible boundaries. The sanctions didn't do a thing because the Russians had spent the previous 8 years preparing for them and executed a brilliant plan to make themselves independent of the West, which succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. On the other hand, the sanctions made Russian exports, energy exports specifically, 4 times more expensive. So suddenly the Russian treasury was absolutely flush with cash and could spend lots of money not only on defense but on social spending. So the idea of social unrest and people protesting in the streets and trying to oust Putin would be ridiculous because he just gave everybody a raise. You know, everybody got what they wanted. Little children got plush toys, and everybody was happy. So the whole plan just completely misfired, and the other effect was that paying quadruple for energy made European economies non-competitive, allowing the Chinese to use this opening to, for instance, steal the entire auto industry from Germany. So all cars, including German cars, are now made not in Germany, but in China, and Germany has to import them. Lots of other things happened at the same time, but basically the entire plan did not work at all. So what does that have to do with Europe? Well, Europe was sort of the, what did that have to do with the Ukraine? Well, Ukraine was the fuse that lit the whole sequence. But Russia was ready for it. And so the big loser in all of that is Washington and the European Union.